When Grace, a young woman with a heart for others, helps a homeless man named Nathan, she has no idea it will change both their lives. Her wealthy, status-obsessed stepmother, Helen, sees this kindness as a weakness and forces Grace into a shocking marriage to Nathan to humiliate them both. But as Grace and Nathan learn to rely on each other, secrets from Nathan's past begin to emerge. Secrets that Helen has hidden to keep her fortune and power. Together, Grace and Nathan must decide if they'll bow to her control or fight for a future built on love and truth. Will their bond survive Helen's schemes? Will long-buried truths finally come to light? Hit subscribe and comment below with your guesses, and join us on this unforgettable journey of betrayal, resilience, and redemption. The winter air in Manhattan had a harsh bite that day, sharp enough to slice through even the heaviest coat. But Nathan Bennett, huddled in his tattered jacket, had long since grown numb to the cold. His blue eyes, once vibrant, were now dulled by exhaustion and disappointment, a reflection of a life that had fallen apart piece by piece. He sat cross-legged on a slush-streaked sidewalk, pressed against the cold granite wall of a department store, watching people hurry past him, their eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding him. Nathan shifted uncomfortably as he tightened his thin, fingerless gloves. His stomach rumbled, the pain gnawing inside him. It had been 2 days since he'd last eaten anything of substance. He whispered to himself, "Just hold out a little longer, Nathan. Maybe today someone will notice." But as the minutes ticked by, the faint spark of hope began to dim. He watched people in pristine wool coats and polished leather boots rush by, laughing, talking, completely oblivious to the man who, despite his best efforts, was invisible among them. In the midst of his despair, the aroma of fresh coffee and grilled sandwiches from a nearby vendor seemed to taunt him, filling his senses and intensifying his hunger. Nathan clenched his fists, his pride the only thing keeping him from standing up and begging for scraps. "Don't sink that low," he told himself. "If you start asking, you'll never stop." Not far from where he sat, Grace Turner strolled down the street, her mind a swirl of thoughts. Despite her polished appearance, long auburn hair tied neatly into a braid, and an understated but elegant wool coat, her heart was troubled. The contrast between her life of privilege and the growing unrest she felt deep within her had become increasingly difficult to reconcile. And that unrest had only worsened under her stepmother Helen's watchful and disapproving eye. As Grace passed the department store, she noticed Nathan huddled against the wall. Unlike the others who had turned away, her gaze lingered. There was something in his eyes that tugged at her heart, something raw and vulnerable that broke through her own internal noise. She hesitated, unsure if she should approach, but the gentle urging in her heart outweighed her hesitation. Without thinking twice, she stepped away from the crowd and made her way over to the food vendor. She returned moments later with a paper bag and a steaming cup of coffee. Kneeling beside Nathan, she gently held out the bag. "Here," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Please take this." Nathan looked up, startled by her presence. He met her eyes, and for a moment he felt a warmth he hadn't known in a long time. The kindness in her expression caught him off guard. He took the bag with trembling hands, managing to choke out a "thank you." His voice was hoarse, heavy with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel for so long. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Grace offered him a small smile. "I'm glad I could help," she replied simply, standing up but lingering for a moment, as if to reassure him he wasn't alone. Across the street, Helen Turner watched the interaction from the tinted window of a sleek black car. Her sharp features hardened as she took in the sight of her stepdaughter kneeling beside a homeless man on the sidewalk. Helen, a woman who had worked tirelessly to position herself among the city's elite, saw Grace's gesture not as an act of kindness, but as an embarrassment, a tarnish on her meticulously maintained reputation. With a huff, Helen opened the car door, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she crossed the street to where Grace was still standing with Nathan. Without acknowledging him, she placed a cold hand on Grace's shoulder, her fingers digging in just enough to convey her displeasure. "Grace!" she hissed, her voice a controlled whisper laced with fury. "What on earth do you think you're doing? Have you lost your mind?" Grace, surprised and caught off guard, glanced at her stepmother. "Helen, he's hungry." "I couldn't just walk by and do nothing." "That's exactly what you should have done. Nothing." Helen's tone was icy as her gaze flicked briefly toward Nathan, who instinctively lowered his head, feeling the weight of her disdain. "These people," she continued, her voice dripping with contempt, "chose this life. If you keep helping them, you'll only encourage their dependency." Grace pulled her arm free from Helen's grasp, her face a mixture of defiance and disappointment. "Not everyone ends up here by choice," she replied, her voice trembling. "Sometimes people just need a second chance." Helen narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Come along, Grace," she ordered, grabbing her arm once more. "I won't allow you to ruin everything I've worked for by mingling with them." As Helen dragged her away, Grace cast one last glance over her shoulder at Nathan, who was still clutching the paper bag. She mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," feeling torn as she allowed herself to be led away. Left alone once more, Nathan held on to the coffee and sandwich, his hands shaking. The warmth from the cup seeped through his fingers, grounding him in the present moment. For the first time in months he felt visible, acknowledged. Grace's kindness lingered in his mind, clashing with Helen's disdain. He couldn't help but wonder why someone like Grace, who clearly came from a different world, would look at him with anything other than pity or disgust. Taking a deep breath, he unwrapped the sandwich slowly, savoring the smell before taking a careful bite. Each taste felt like a gift, a fleeting reminder of what he'd lost but hadn't entirely forgotten. He had once believed in a life filled with purpose, dignity, and dreams. But life had other plans, dragging him to this point, one small defeat at a time. As he ate, two other homeless men nearby watched him with hollow eyes. Nathan hesitated, glancing down at his sandwich. Despite his own hunger, he felt a strange impulse to share it. Taking a deep breath, he broke it into 3 pieces and motioned for them to come over. "Hey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's not much, but let's share. No one should have to go hungry." The 2 men approached him gratefully, their eyes filled with the same gratitude he had felt moments before. Together they ate in silence, a shared moment of solace amidst the loneliness and struggle that defined their lives. As Nathan shared the food with the others, Grace watched from a distance, lingering near the car where Helen was busy on her phone, complaining to a friend about Grace's embarrassing display. Grace's heart swelled as she saw Nathan sharing the sandwich with the others. That single act of kindness, given to him, had multiplied, sparking something that, while small, felt like a glimmer of hope. In that moment, she realized that what she felt toward Nathan was more than just pity. It was a desire to understand, to connect beyond the walls her stepmother had built around her. She didn't know why, but something in her wanted to believe that helping someone like him was worth any scorn Helen might throw her way. However, Helen, sensing Grace's gaze was still on the man across the street, reached out and grabbed her arm again, pulling her close. "Forget about him, Grace," she ordered, her voice low and threatening. "You have no idea how dangerous people like him are. And if you don't want to be dragged down with them, you'll learn to walk away." Grace said nothing, but her heart held on to the moment with Nathan. The seed of rebellion against her stepmother's views had taken root, and with it, an unspoken promise to herself. She would help others, no matter what Helen said. Later that evening, Grace sat quietly in the spacious living room of her family's brownstone. The Turners' residence was filled with luxury and comfort, yet for Grace, it often felt cold and distant. A place where warmth was measured by appearances and status rather than love. As she stared into the glow of the fireplace, her thoughts kept drifting back to Nathan. His face, worn and lined by hardship, had stirred something in her, a calling to act on her compassion rather than suppress it. Just then, Helen entered the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She was a woman who seemed to absorb attention wherever she went, her presence both commanding and intimidating. With an air of irritation, she regarded Grace, who sat lost in thought. "You know, Grace, today's little incident left quite an impression on me," Helen began, her voice clipped. Grace looked up, feeling a familiar knot of tension in her chest. "I only wanted to help someone who was struggling. I don't understand why that's such a problem. Helen's gaze hardened. The problem, Grace, is that people of our standing don't involve ourselves with those who've chosen a life on the streets. It's unbecoming. I've worked hard to earn our place in this city, and I won't let you jeopardize it with misplaced pity. It's not pities, Grace countered, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with conviction. It's kindness. Helen let out a bitter laugh, crossing her arms. You're so naive. Kindness? These people will take whatever they can get from you and leave you with nothing. It's time you understand how the world works, Grace. Sometimes the best way to help people like him is to do nothing at all. Grace bit her lip, holding back the retort that threatened to rise. Every fiber of her being wanted to argue, to tell Helen that helping someone wasn't something she could ever regret. But instead, she held her tongue, knowing all too well that arguing would only make things worse. Seeing Grace's silence as compliance, Helen's expression softened slightly, though the glint of superiority in her eyes remained. Good. I'm glad you're coming to your senses, she said. The sooner you realize your place, the easier life will be for both of us. Without waiting for a reply, Helen turned on her heel and left the room. Grace watched her go, a sense of helplessness washing over her. Yet, beneath the frustration, a new determination was taking root. No matter what Helen said, she couldn't shake the feeling that her kindness to Nathan had been the right thing to do, and for the first time, she resolved to trust her instincts, even if it meant facing Helen's disapproval. Meanwhile, Nathan sat alone on a park bench several blocks away, his thin coat pulled tight against the cold. The sandwich Grace had given him was long gone, but the warmth of her kindness lingered. It had been a simple act, yet to Nathan, it felt monumental, a reminder that there were still people who saw him as more than just a beggar on the street. As he looked up at the starlit sky, a mix of emotions filled his mind. Gratitude, loneliness, and a faint glimmer of hope. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him the way Grace had, with genuine empathy instead of pity or disgust. He closed his eyes, letting the memory of her kindness settle into his heart. But even as he found comfort in the thought, he knew the reality of his situation hadn't changed. Tomorrow he'd wake up on the same cold streets, with the same struggle to survive. And yet something about that encounter had stirred within him a desire to try, if not for himself, then for the people who still believed he was worth saving. Back at the Turner household, Helen sat in her study, her fingers tapping impatiently on the edge of her desk. Though she'd managed to pull Grace away from that beggar, the incident gnawed at her. Grace's defiance was becoming more frequent, and Helen feared her control was slipping. As she sat there, a thought began to take shape. A plan that, if executed properly, could rid her of this growing problem and teach Grace a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. She needed a way to show Grace that her so-called kindness would only lead to disappointment and ruin. And what better way than to force her into a situation that would expose the very people she insisted on helping? A small smile crept onto Helen's face as the plan solidified in her mind. She would arrange a marriage between Grace and that beggar. It would humiliate Grace, dissuade her from her charitable impulses, and place her firmly back under Helen's control. Helen sat back in her chair, pleased with herself. Tomorrow, she would track down the man from the street and make him an offer he couldn't refuse. One way or another, Grace would learn that kindness was a weakness, and Helen would do whatever it took to restore order in her carefully curated life. The following afternoon, Helen stepped out of a black car parked near the same department store where Grace had first encountered Nathan. Her well-heeled steps echoed sharply as she approached the sidewalk where he sat, oblivious to her presence as he rummaged through an old, worn bag. Nathan looked up, startled, as Helen's shadow fell across him. Her appearance felt out of place here, an imposing figure in a tailored coat and expensive leather gloves, looking down at him with a mixture of disdain and calculation. "Mr. Bennett, is it?" Helen asked, her voice cool and impersonal. Nathan hesitated, unsure if he should answer. "Yes, that's me." Helen smiled, though there was no warmth in her expression. "I have an offer for you, something that could change your life if you're wise enough to accept it." Nathan furrowed his brow, confused and cautious. "What kind of offer?" "I'll get straight to the point," Helen replied, her voice sharp. My stepdaughter Grace has developed an unfortunate tendency to sympathize with people like you. It's a distraction, and one that I need to address. I believe the best solution is for you and Grace to marry." Nathan's eyes widened in shock. "Marry her? I don't understand." "Think of it as a transaction," Helen continued, her tone clinical. "In exchange, you would have access to all the luxuries you could imagine: food, shelter, clothes, a life of comfort, far removed from these streets. All I ask is that you play your part and keep her under control." The implications sank in, and Nathan felt a mixture of anger and desperation rising within him. "So you want me to deceive her? To trick her into a marriage?" Helen's smile remained, untouched by his reaction. "It's hardly a trick. I'll compensate you handsomely, and you'll never have to beg for anything again. Imagine how many lives you could improve, your own included, if you had a steady income and resources." Nathan hesitated, feeling torn. The offer was tempting in a way he hadn't anticipated. Part of him wanted to refuse outright, to tell her he wouldn't be a pawn in her twisted game. But the promise of a stable life, the thought of finally leaving the streets and being able to help others like himself, lingered in his mind. Could this be a chance to do some real good? He wondered. As Helen's offer hung in the air, Nathan's thoughts drifted back to the people he knew on the streets, the friends who shared his daily struggles, the people who had nothing yet clung to hope. He remembered the kindness Grace had shown him and the way it had renewed his spirit, if only for a moment. Perhaps, he thought, this marriage could offer more than just a way out. Perhaps it could be a chance to change things for the better. Taking a deep breath, Nathan met Helen's gaze. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because people like me deserve a chance. I won't hurt Grace, but I'll play along." Helen's smile grew colder. "Excellent choice, Mr. Bennett. You'll have everything you could ever want, provided you remember your place." As she turned to leave, Nathan felt a chill settle over him. He knew he'd agreed to a deal that would bind him to Helen's plans, but a part of him clung to the hope that somehow, some way, he could turn this situation into something good, for Grace and for himself. It was an unusually cold morning, and Grace sat in the large dining room sipping her tea and absent-mindedly stirring it. The usual routines of the Turner household carried on around her, but her mind kept drifting back to Nathan, wondering if he'd managed to find a warm place to sleep that night. The image of his grateful face as she handed him the sandwich lingered, stirring something hopeful in her heart. Her thoughts were interrupted when Helen entered the room, her presence commanding attention as she strode in with an air of satisfaction. Grace glanced up, noticing the slight smirk on her stepmother's face, and felt a familiar pang of apprehension. Helen only looked like this when she had something planned, something that usually didn't bode well for Grace. "Good morning, dear," Helen greeted, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She sat down across from Grace, folding her hands neatly on the table. "I have some rather exciting news to share." Grace raised an eyebrow, bracing herself. "What news?" Helen leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming. "You're getting married, Grace. It's all been arranged." Grace's hand froze, the spoon clinking against the side of her cup. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't agree to any marriage." "Oh, but you don't have to," Helen replied smoothly, her voice laced with condescension. "You see, I've found a perfect match for you, someone who truly reflects your interests." Grace felt her stomach drop. "Who?" she managed to ask, dread seeping into her words. Helen's smirk widened. "The man you were so eager to help the other day. That beggar, Nathan Bennett." A stunned silence filled the room. Grace's heart raced as she tried to process what her stepmother had just said. "Nathan?" Her mind reeled with questions, with disbelief, but mostly with an overwhelming sense of betrayal. "This is insane," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't seriously expect me to marry him." "Oh, but I can," Helen replied, her tone sharpening. "You wanted to help him, didn't you? Well, now you can help him every day. You'll have plenty of time together, and you'll learn that these people you feel so compassionate toward aren't as deserving as you think." Grace's face paled as she realized the true intent behind Helen's scheme. This wasn't about finding her a husband. It was about punishment, about humiliation. Helen wanted to make her regret ever showing kindness to someone on the streets. "What about father?" Grace asked, grasping for some hope of escape. "He would never agree to this." Helen's gaze narrowed, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Your father trusts my judgment on such matters, and I made it clear to him that you needed guidance." Grace stared at her stepmother, disbelief giving way to a smoldering anger. "This is cruel even for you, Helen." "Cruel?" Helen scoffed. "Cruel is watching you waste your life sympathizing with people who don't deserve it. I'm simply giving you a lesson in reality." Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You can't force me to marry him. I won't go through with it." Helen's expression hardened. "Oh, but you will, my dear, because if you don't, I'll make sure Nathan pays the price. I'll see to it that he's left with nothing, that he's barred from every shelter in the city. It's all within my power." A cold wave of fear washed over Grace as she realized the depths of Helen's manipulation. She felt trapped, cornered by a choice that was no choice at all. Across the city, Nathan stood outside the Turner mansion, feeling out of place and nervous. Helen had summoned him that morning, arranging for a driver to bring him directly to the estate. Now, as he gazed up at the towering house, a part of him wondered if he'd made the right decision. A butler opened the door and gestured for Nathan to enter. As he walked through the grand foyer, his worn coat and scuffed boots seemed glaringly out of place amid the marble floors and expensive furnishings. He was led to a parlor, where Helen sat waiting, her demeanor cold and calculating. "Nathan?" she began smoothly, motioning for him to sit. "I take it you've given our arrangement some thought?" Nathan nodded, though unease twisted in his stomach. "Yes, ma'am. I'll go through with it. But I need to be clear. I'm only doing this to help people like me, to make a difference." Helen's smile was thin and humorless. Of course. Whatever you need to tell yourself to feel better about this arrangement." Just then the door opened, and Grace entered, her face pale and eyes wide with shock as she caught sight of Nathan. She looked from him to Helen, her gaze filled with betrayal. "So it's true," she whispered. Nathan looked away, unable to meet her eyes. A part of him wanted to explain, to tell her that he hadn't meant to deceive her. But Helen's presence loomed, a constant reminder of what was at stake. "Grace," Helen said, her voice laced with satisfaction, "I trust you understand the arrangement. This is for your own good, after all." Grace's hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Nathan," she said, her voice trembling, Do you want this?" Nathan swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Grace, I know this isn't what you wanted, and it's not what I wanted either. But maybe we can make something good out of it. Maybe we can help each other." The words felt hollow even to him, but he clung to the hope that somehow this forced union could lead to something positive. Grace searched his face, her own expression softening just slightly. Beneath the anger and betrayal, there was a flicker of understanding, a glimmer of compassion. But Helen was quick to interrupt, clapping her hands as if sealing a deal. "Perfect. I'll leave you two to get acquainted. After all, you have a wedding to plan." As she left the room, Grace and Nathan stood in silence, the weight of their shared predicament settling heavily between them. In the days that followed, Grace and Nathan found themselves in an uncomfortable routine, brought together not by choice, but by circumstance. They spent long hours together, discussing plans for the wedding Helen was rushing to arrange, but the tension between them was palpable. Nathan, sensing Grace's lingering resentment, tried to bridge the gap. "I never wanted this either, Grace," he said one evening as they walked through the garden, "but I've been given so few chances in life. I thought, maybe I could make something of this." Grace looked at him, her gaze softened by his honesty. "I know, Nathan. I don't blame you. I blame Helen. But I don't understand why you'd agree to this." Nathan hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "Because, for once, I felt like I could do something that mattered. That maybe, if I could help others like me, this marriage wouldn't be a complete loss." Grace studied him, a faint glimmer of hope sparking in her heart. Despite everything, she found herself drawn to Nathan's resilience, his quiet determination to find purpose even in this forced situation. "I've always wanted to make a difference too," she murmured, almost to herself. Maybe we can do that together." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the tension melted away, replaced by a tentative connection. Though neither dared to voice it, both felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, in the midst of this twisted arrangement, something real could grow. As the wedding day drew closer, Helen intensified her grip on the situation, micromanaging every detail with a ruthless efficiency that left no room for protest. Grace and Nathan found themselves pulled along by her relentless pace, swept up in a whirlwind of preparations that felt more like a punishment than a celebration. One evening, as Grace prepared for bed, Helen entered her room, a thinly veiled smile on her lips. "I hope you're ready for tomorrow, Grace," she said. "This marriage will be the best lesson you'll ever learn." Grace turned to her, a steely determination in her eyes. "You might think you're teaching me something, Helen, but all you're doing is showing me the lengths you'll go to just to maintain control. I may be marrying Nathan, but I won't become what you want me to be." Helen's expression darkened. "We'll see about that," she replied coldly. "You'll learn to play by my rules, whether you like it or not." As she left, Grace felt a surge of resolve. She knew Helen's game, but she refused to let herself be broken by it. Tomorrow she would marry Nathan, but not as a victim of her stepmother's cruelty. She would marry him on her own terms, with a plan of her own. The morning dawned gray and misty, as if the weather itself sensed the weight of the day ahead. Grace sat in front of her bedroom mirror, barely recognizing the reflection that stared back at her. Dressed in a simple yet elegant white gown, her auburn hair styled delicately, she looked the part of a bride, but her heart felt far from the joy such a day should bring. A gentle knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Nathan standing in the doorway, looking equally uneasy in a dark suit that, while neatly tailored, still seemed slightly foreign to him. The Nathan she'd met on the street just days before had vanished, replaced by a man who looked more at home here, though his face still held traces of wear and wariness. Grace managed a small smile. "Nathan?" she said softly. "I didn't expect to see you before the ceremony." He stepped into the room, his expression both apologetic and earnest. "I wanted to see you before everything starts. Just to say that, no matter what happens, I'll respect whatever you want out of this arrangement." The honesty in his words touched her, easing some of the anxiety knotting her stomach. She knew he was as much a victim in this as she was, and for a moment, that shared understanding drew them closer. "Thank you, Nathan," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe we can make the best of this somehow." They shared a quiet look, an unspoken promise forming between them. Though the path ahead was uncertain, they were facing it together, and that, for now, was enough. The ceremony took place in a small, elegant chapel that Helen had chosen, packed with carefully selected guests from the city's elite. Grace felt every pair of eyes on her as she walked down the aisle, her heart pounding as she approached Nathan, who stood waiting at the altar, his face a mixture of resolve and apprehension. As the officiant began, Grace's thoughts wandered to her late mother, the memory of her gentle voice urging Grace to always choose kindness, even when it was difficult. She'd often wondered what her mother would think of Helen, with her fixation on status, and her refusal to embrace even the smallest acts of compassion. When it came time to exchange vows, Nathan's hand trembled slightly as he took hers. He looked into her eyes, and for the briefest moment, it felt like they were alone, as though the crowd of judgmental onlookers had faded away. "Grace," he began, his voice steadying, "I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes our way. You've shown me a kindness I'll never forget. I know this isn't conventional, but I'm here to make the best of it with you." Grace felt her heart tighten, hearing the sincerity in his words. "Thank you, Nathan," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Whatever this marriage means, we'll face it together." They exchanged rings, and as the officiant declared them husband and wife, Nathan gave her hand a gentle squeeze, as if to reassure her that they weren't alone in this. The reception that followed was a whirlwind of clinking glasses, congratulatory smiles, and whispers that hung heavy in the air. Grace could feel the weight of her new reality, surrounded by people who viewed her marriage as an odd spectacle, rather than a celebration. But she clung to Nathan's arm, finding comfort in his presence. Later in the evening, they managed to steal a quiet moment away from the guests, slipping out to a small balcony that overlooked the city. The fresh air was a welcome relief, washing away the cloying scent of perfume and champagne from inside. Nathan leaned against the railing, gazing out over the city lights. "So this is it," he said, his tone a mix of resignation and hope. "Our new life." Grace joined him, feeling a strange sense of calm despite everything. "Maybe it's not as bleak as it seems," she said, surprising herself with the optimism in her voice. "We're here now, together. And maybe we can make a real difference." Nathan looked at her, his expression softening. "You're serious, aren't you?" She nodded, her resolve growing. "I know it sounds strange, but I feel like this marriage doesn't have to be a punishment. If we can find a way to use this for good, maybe we can change a few things." A glimmer of admiration flickered in Nathan's eyes. "You amaze me, Grace," he murmured. "Despite everything, you still believe there's hope." Grace shrugged, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "I guess I just can't accept that kindness is a weakness. Not after seeing what it did for you." Nathan reached out, placing a gentle hand on hers. "Then let's do it," he said, his voice filled with newfound determination. "Let's make this marriage about more than just Helen's schemes." They shared a quiet moment, feeling the first true bond between them solidify. Whatever came next, they had each other, and that was enough to build something meaningful. Inside the mansion, Helen watched from afar as Grace and Nathan spoke on the balcony, her face darkening as she took in the easy connection between them. This was not what she'd intended. She'd expected Grace to resent her new husband, to buckle under the pressure of this forced union, but instead, it seemed that the marriage had brought them closer. Fuming, Helen stormed through the reception hall, her carefully constructed plans beginning to unravel. She hadn't anticipated that Grace would actually find solace in Nathan's presence, nor that Nathan would defy her expectations by treating Grace with respect. Determined to regain control, Helen called over one of the servers, instructing him to send Nathan to her study later in the evening. If she couldn't break their bond, she would at least make it clear to Nathan who held the real power in their arrangement. Nathan found himself in Helen's study later that night, his hands clasped tightly as he sat across from her. Helen regarded him with a disdainful glare, her eyes hard as she leaned forward, her voice low and menacing. "You may have charmed Grace, but don't think for a second that you're anything more than a pawn in this game," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. "If you think you can come in here and play the role of the good husband, you're sorely mistaken." Nathan met her gaze, his expression steady. "I never wanted to deceive Grace. I agreed to this because you promised me a way out of the streets, and a way to help others. But I won't be part of your game." Helen's mouth twisted into a cold smile. "Oh, you think you have a choice?" She leaned back, folding her hands. "I control everything in Grace's life, including you. The moment you step out of line, I'll make sure you lose everything I've given you." A surge of anger rose in Nathan's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You may control the money, but you don't control us. Grace and I will make this work, with or without you." For a moment, Helen looked taken aback by his defiance, but she quickly regained her composure, her gaze sharpening. "I won't tolerate insubordination, Nathan. Remember that this marriage isn't about you. It's about teaching Grace a lesson." Nathan stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "Maybe it's you who needs to learn a lesson, Helen. People aren't pawns. You can move around at your convenience. Grace has more strength and compassion than you'll ever understand." With that, he turned and left, leaving Helen simmering with anger in his wake. Back in their private quarters, Nathan found Grace waiting, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern as he entered. "What did Helen want?" she asked quietly. Nathan hesitated, then shook his head. "She just wanted to remind me of my place," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "But it doesn't matter. She can't control us, Grace. Not if we stand together." Grace's eyes softened as she took a step toward him. "Then let's do just that. No matter what she throws at us, we'll face it together." They stood in silence, an unspoken promise strengthening the bond between them. It was a fragile alliance, one born of circumstance and adversity. But it was also the start of something powerful, something that neither of them had anticipated. As they lay down to sleep that night, Grace and Nathan found a quiet sense of peace in each other's presence, and though they didn't yet know what the future held, they felt, for the first time, a sense of purpose and unity that transcended Helen's manipulations. As the days passed, Nathan and Grace settled into a new routine, learning to navigate the complexities of their unexpected marriage. They shared quiet moments together, discussing plans to help the homeless and those in need, gradually building a partnership that felt genuine and hopeful. Meanwhile, Helen watched from the sidelines, her frustration growing. She had orchestrated this entire scheme to teach Grace a lesson about sympathy, to prove that kindness was a weakness. Yet here Grace was, not only embracing her marriage to Nathan, but also showing an unexpected strength and resilience that defied Helen's control. One evening, Helen paced her study, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Her carefully laid plans were slipping through her fingers, and she was running out of options. She needed something drastic, something that would finally break Grace's resolve, and expose Nathan for the undeserving man Helen believed him to be. In her search for a way to drive a wedge between them, Helen remembered a brooch, an old family heirloom she had kept hidden away, a link to a past she had tried to erase. Perhaps, she thought, there was a way to use it to stir up doubts and insecurities in Nathan, to shake the confidence he and Grace had found in each other. The official wedding reception took place at a luxurious ballroom downtown, a grand event Helen had planned to display her family's status to the elite circles of New York. She spared no expense, ensuring that the evening would reflect the Turner family's affluence and prominence. However, for Grace and Nathan, the affair felt hollow, a charade to mask the truth of their forced union. As the guests arrived, murmurs filled the room, whispers of intrigue about the unusual marriage of the Turner heiress to a man who, only weeks ago, had been living on the streets. Grace noticed the curious glances and forced smiles, but she held her head high, finding strength in Nathan's quiet support beside her. During the reception, Helen took every opportunity to introduce Nathan to high society guests in a way that emphasized his unfortunate background. Her thinly veiled insults disguised as polite remarks didn't go unnoticed by Grace or Nathan, but they each silently agreed not to let Helen's schemes ruin the evening. At one point, Helen approached Grace, her voice laced with condescension as she spoke loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "My dear, I do hope you're finding your new life fulfilling. It's not often one gets the chance to experience such an unconventional marriage." Grace clenched her jaw, sensing the thinly veiled insult, but kept her expression calm. "Nathan and I are doing just fine. Thank you, Helen. In fact, I'd say we're quite happy." Helen's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered, turning her attention to Nathan. "And you, Nathan, how are you finding this new life? Quite different from what you're used to, I imagine." Nathan met her gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "It is different," he replied evenly, "but Grace has made it worthwhile." Grace felt a surge of pride at his response, and for a moment Helen seemed at a loss for words. But her eyes narrowed, a calculating gleam flickering across her face as she continued her mission to undermine them. Later in the evening, as the reception continued, Nathan excused himself and stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The ballroom felt stifling, and he needed a few minutes to clear his mind. The evening's endless parade of judgmental glances and whispered conversations had taken its toll, leaving him with a sense of unease. As he wandered down a dimly lit hallway, he noticed a small display case against the wall, its glass doors reflecting the dim light. Inside was a collection of antique jewelry, each piece carefully arranged. But one piece in particular caught his attention, a gold brooch with an intricate rose design intertwined with vines. Nathan stared at the brooch, feeling a strange sense of familiarity wash over him. Memories he'd long since buried began to surface, fragments of his childhood, moments he could barely recall. He remembered holding that brooch in his small hands, the way it had shimmered under the light as he listened to a woman's soft singing, a memory that felt both comforting and painful. Unable to shake the feeling, Nathan reached out, placing his hand on the glass as he tried to piece together the scattered memories. "Why does this feel so familiar?" he wondered, his mind racing. But before he could dwell on it further, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Helen standing behind him, her expression unreadable as she followed his gaze to the brooch. For a fleeting moment she seemed taken aback, as though she hadn't expected anyone to notice the piece. But she quickly composed herself, offering a thin smile. "Do you like it?" she asked, her voice as smooth as silk. "It's an old family heirloom." Nathan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the brooch. "It just reminds me of something." Helen's smile grew colder, her tone shifting to one of subtle menace. "Well, it's just a trinket now. Nothing more than a piece of the past. We all have to let go of the past at some point, don't we?" Nathan sensed a warning in her words, a reminder that he was under her control. But even as he nodded politely and moved to rejoin the reception, the memory of the brooch lingered in his mind, stirring questions he couldn't ignore. Back inside the ballroom, Grace found herself drawn into conversations with old acquaintances and distant relatives, each interaction laced with polite curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. She felt a sense of isolation in the crowd, as though she were a stranger among her own family and friends. When Nathan returned, she sensed a subtle shift in him, a distraction that hadn't been there before. She watched him from across the room, noticing the way his gaze seemed to drift, his expression thoughtful and distant. The realization tugged at her heart. He was as out of place here as she was, both of them trapped in a world that neither of them belonged to. As the evening wore on, Grace found an opportunity to pull Nathan aside, leading him to a quiet corner near the balcony. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, her voice filled with concern. Nathan hesitated, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they were alone. I think I remembered something from my past." Grace's eyes widened. "What is it?" He shook his head, struggling to put his thoughts into words. "There's a brooch in the hallway, a rose with vines. I remember seeing it when I was a child. Someone close to me had it." Grace placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Maybe it's a clue, something that can help you find out more about where you came from." Nathan met her gaze, feeling a surge of gratitude. "You're the only one who seems to care about my past. Helen just keeps telling me it doesn't matter." Grace's expression hardened slightly at the mention of her stepmother, but she forced a smile. "Well, Helen doesn't know everything. If you think this brooch is important, we'll figure out what it means, together." Nathan's heart lifted at her words. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, with Grace's support, he could piece together the fragments of his lost past. Later that night, as the reception wound down, Helen pulled Grace aside, her tone sharp and accusatory. "I noticed you and Nathan sneaking off," she said, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Whatever plans you two are concocting, remember who holds the power in this family." Grace met her stepmother's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Nathan and I are just trying to build a life together, Helen. Isn't that what marriage is about?" Helen's eyes flashed with anger. "Marriage is about obedience and respect, two things you clearly have no understanding of." Grace clenched her fists, struggling to keep her temper in check. "Maybe that's how you see it, but Nathan and I are determined to make this work. On our terms." Helen's smile was cold and threatening. "Keep pushing, Grace, and you'll see just how fragile this so-called marriage really is. I have the power to ruin both of you if I choose." But Grace stood firm, her voice steady and calm. "Do whatever you want, Helen, but you won't break us." For the first time, Helen seemed taken aback by Grace's defiance, a flicker of uncertainty flashing in her eyes. She turned and walked away, leaving Grace with a newfound sense of empowerment. Though she knew the battle with Helen was far from over, she felt stronger than ever, determined to protect her marriage and Nathan from her stepmother's schemes. That night, as Grace and Nathan returned to their room, they sat together, discussing the events of the evening. They shared their fears and hopes, finding comfort in each other's company. Grace took Nathan's hand, her voice filled with resolve. "We can't keep letting her control us. We have to find a way to be free." Nathan nodded, a quiet determination in his eyes. "Agreed. And I think I know where we can start." He explained his suspicions about the brooch and its connection to his past, suggesting that perhaps Helen had been hiding more than just her disdain for the less fortunate. Together, they resolved to uncover the truth, to dig into the secrets Helen had buried, and to free themselves from her grasp once and for all. As they lay down that night, Grace and Nathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Though their marriage had begun as a means of control, it had become something more. A partnership forged in adversity, bound by a shared determination to find the truth and reclaim their lives. The next morning, Grace and Nathan sat together in their bedroom. Their voices hushed as they discussed Helen's unusual reaction to the brooch at the reception. Nathan described the memory it stirred in him, a distant recollection that left him feeling unsettled yet curious. It was like a puzzle piece snapping into place, hinting at something larger that he couldn't quite grasp. "What do you remember about it?" Grace asked, her hand resting reassuringly on his arm. Nathan took a deep breath, closing his eyes as he tried to summon the memory. "I was very young, maybe 3 or 4. I remember a woman, someone who felt safe, like family. She wore that brooch, and there was singing. It was just a moment, but it's so vivid in my mind." Grace listened intently, her expression thoughtful. That brooch might be more than just an heirloom. If it connects to your past, it could mean Helen knows something she hasn't told us. Nathan nodded. "We need to find out where it came from and what it means. If Helen's hiding something about my family, then maybe this could be the key to understanding why she's so determined to control both of us." They decided to begin by searching through family records, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might reveal the brooch's origins and its connection to Nathan's childhood. Their investigation led them to the city's archives, a grand but quiet building filled with shelves of dusty records and old documents. Grace had convinced the librarian to allow them access to private family records, claiming it was a project for their family's history. As they combed through files and family trees, Nathan found himself drawn to one specific folder bearing the name Howard, a family name he had a faint memory of, though he couldn't explain why. Grace noticed his interest and encouraged him to open it. Inside, Nathan found a list of names and dates, and one in particular caught his eye. Jonathan Howard. The name felt strangely familiar, stirring memories that were almost within reach, yet still elusive. "Jonathan Howard," he murmured, tracing the name with his finger. That was my father's name." Grace's eyes widened as she looked over his shoulder, scanning the documents with renewed urgency. "Nathan, if this is your family, then Helen must have known your father. Maybe she even knew what happened to him." The revelation felt overwhelming, and Nathan leaned back, struggling to process the implications. "If Helen knew my father, then why did she keep it a secret? Why would she go to such lengths to hide my identity?" "Maybe she had something to gain from it," Grace suggested quietly, her tone heavy with suspicion. "Maybe she didn't want anyone to know who you really are." Nathan felt a wave of anger rising within him, a realization that he'd been kept in the dark about his own life, manipulated by Helen for reasons he still couldn't fully understand. "We have to confront her," he said, his voice filled with determination. "If she's been lying to me, and to you, we deserve to know the truth." Returning to the mansion, Grace and Nathan prepared to confront Helen. Nathan clutched the documents they'd found, his heart pounding as he replayed the discoveries in his mind. Though he was anxious, he was also resolute. After years of wandering, of not knowing who he really was, he was finally on the verge of reclaiming his past. They found Helen in her study, reviewing paperwork with a look of satisfaction that only fueled Nathan's anger. Grace stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "Helen, we need to talk." Helen glanced up, her expression quickly shifting to one of irritation. "Grace, can't you see I'm busy?" "Whatever it is, it can wait." "No," Nathan replied, his voice laced with barely contained emotion. "It can't wait. I need to know the truth about my family, and about you." Helen's face paled slightly, but she quickly recovered, her gaze turning cold and calculating. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, though there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Nathan stepped closer, holding up the documents. "We found records, Helen. Records of the Howard family. My family. You knew my father, didn't you?" "Jonathan Howard?" For a brief moment, Helen's composure cracked, her eyes widening with a mixture of shock and anger. But she quickly schooled her expression, meeting Nathan's gaze with a disdainful smile. "I don't know where you found those, but it doesn't change anything. The past is irrelevant, Nathan. You're nothing more than a charity case I took pity on." Grace's voice cut through the tension, filled with quiet strength. "Stop lying, Helen. We know you've been hiding this. Just tell us the truth." Helen's gaze shifted from Nathan to Grace, a dangerous gleam flashing in her eyes. "Fine," she hissed, her tone dripping with bitterness. "If you want the truth, here it is. Jonathan Howard was your father, Nathan. But he was also a fool, a man who let compassion cloud his judgment." Nathan clenched his fists, fighting to keep his voice steady. "And what about me? Why did you hide my identity? Why did you let me grow up on the streets?" Helen's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Because you were an obstacle, Nathan. When your father died, his fortune was left to his only child. But with you gone, I became the rightful heir. You were a loose end that needed to be tied up." The revelation hit Nathan like a physical blow, his mind reeling as he processed the depth of Helen's betrayal. She had orchestrated his abandonment, stolen his inheritance, and erased his very existence, all for the sake of wealth and power. Grace stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "You did this to your own family just for money? You tore apart a family, condemned a child to suffer, all because you wanted more." Helen sneered, her mask of civility slipping. "Don't act so righteous, Grace. The world is harsh, and sometimes you have to make sacrifices. Besides, Nathan isn't family. He was just a means to an end." Shaken and enraged, Nathan and Grace retreated to their room, their minds racing as they considered their next steps. The truth was out, but Helen's influence still loomed, and they knew that exposing her fully would require more than just an accusation. As they talked, Grace took Nathan's hand, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We need proof, something that can reveal what she did and make her face the consequences. This isn't just about us, Nathan. It's about justice." Nathan nodded, his resolve hardening. "You're right. She stole everything from me, and she used both of us to keep her secret. If we can bring this to light, we can finally put an end to her control." Together, they formulated a plan to gather evidence of Helen's crimes. They decided to start by searching the mansion, hoping to uncover any documents or records that might expose her schemes. They also resolved to involve the authorities, knowing that Helen's betrayal went far beyond personal grievances and bordered on criminal manipulation. In the days that followed, Grace and Nathan searched tirelessly, combing through files and records in Helen's office whenever they had the chance. Their efforts finally paid off when Grace stumbled upon a hidden compartment in one of Helen's drawers, containing a collection of documents that detailed the transfer of Jonathan Howard's assets to Helen following his death. Included in the documents was a letter, handwritten and dated years ago, in which Helen outlined her plans to claim Jonathan's inheritance. The letter spoke of Nathan, referred to only as the boy, and described her intention to have him removed from her life permanently. As Grace and Nathan read the letter together, a mixture of relief and anger washed over them. They now had undeniable proof of Helen's actions, a document that revealed her manipulation and deceit in her own words. With the evidence in hand, they contacted a lawyer, a friend of the Howard family who agreed to help them build a case against Helen. The lawyer assured them that with the proof they'd gathered, they had a strong chance of not only reclaiming Nathan's inheritance, but also holding Helen accountable for her actions. Armed with their newfound evidence, Grace and Nathan arranged a final confrontation with Helen, summoning her to the family lawyer's office. Helen arrived, her confidence replaced by a growing unease as she noticed the stack of documents waiting on the desk. The lawyer presented the evidence, detailing Helen's manipulation of Jonathan Howard's estate and her abandonment of Nathan. Helen's face turned pale as the full extent of her actions was laid bare, her usual composure fracturing under the weight of her exposure. Realizing her options were limited, Helen attempted to negotiate, offering to return Nathan's inheritance in exchange for their silence. But Nathan and Grace stood firm, refusing to accept anything less than justice. With no other choice, Helen was forced to relinquish her control over the Howard estate, her status and reputation irreparably damaged. The scandal rocked the elite circles she had once ruled, leaving her ostracized and disgraced. With Helen removed from their lives, Nathan and Grace began the long process of rebuilding. Nathan's inheritance was restored, allowing them to fund the charitable initiatives they had dreamed of. establishing programs to help the homeless and those in need. Through their shared journey, their partnership grew into a deep and lasting bond, a love forged in hardship and strengthened by their mutual determination to make a difference. As they looked toward the future, they knew that their story, once defined by manipulation and betrayal, had become one of resilience and hope, a testament to the power of compassion and the strength of the human spirit. With the lawyer's assistance, Grace and Nathan prepared their case to expose Helen's crimes in court. Their evidence was strong: documents of property transfers, the letter that revealed Helen's plans to discard Nathan, and testimony from family friends who could confirm Helen's manipulations. The weight of their decision wasn't lost on either of them. For Grace, this was more than a legal battle. It was about reclaiming her autonomy and putting an end to years of manipulation. For Nathan, it was a chance to reclaim the identity and family he'd lost, to finally take his place in the world on his own terms. As the court date approached, Nathan took Grace's hand, looking at her with gratitude. "Whatever happens, thank you for being my partner in this. I wouldn't be here without you." Grace's smile was soft but resolute. "We're in this together, Nathan. You don't have to thank me. We both deserve this chance." The courtroom was silent as the judge took his seat, glancing over the evidence that lay in front of him. Helen sat across from Grace and Nathan, her once confident demeanor replaced by an air of unease, her gaze darting nervously between the judge and her lawyer. Nathan's lawyer presented the case with precision, laying out Helen's manipulations with each piece of evidence. He began with the inheritance documents, showing how Helen had transferred Jonathan Howard's assets to herself shortly after his death. Next came the letter, in which Helen had outlined her intentions to remove the boy from her life, treating Nathan as nothing more than an inconvenience. The judge's expression grew increasingly severe as he read the letter, his gaze narrowing as he looked toward Helen. When it was Helen's turn to speak, she attempted to portray herself as the victim of unfortunate circumstances, claiming she had only acted to protect her family. But the judge remained unmoved, focusing instead on the evidence of her deception and the harm she had caused to Nathan. After a brief deliberation, he declared that Helen's actions had been manipulative, self-serving, and driven by greed. Her inheritance of the Howard estate was invalidated, and her control over the assets was formally revoked. Nathan's heart lifted as he listened to the judge's decision, feeling a wave of relief and vindication wash over him. After years of uncertainty, he had finally reclaimed his identity and his rightful place. Grace gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, her own relief evident in her smile. In the days following the court's decision, Helen's life began to unravel. Her carefully constructed world of influence and wealth crumbled, her reputation tarnished by the scandal. Former friends and social connections turned their backs on her, unwilling to be associated with the woman who had manipulated her way to fortune. As her assets were seized, Helen found herself facing a harsh reality she had never anticipated, one without wealth or influence, where the people she had once looked down upon were the ones she now relied on. For the first time, she experienced the very vulnerability she had condemned in others, a reality that left her isolated and powerless. In a final attempt to salvage her pride, Helen reached out to Grace, hoping to appeal to her compassion. She arrived unannounced at the community center that Grace and Nathan were establishing, her expression a mixture of bitterness and desperation. "Grace," Helen said, her voice shaking slightly, "surely you wouldn't turn your back on family. I made mistakes, but I was only trying to protect us." Grace's expression remained calm but resolute. "Family isn't about control or manipulation, Helen. Family means supporting each other, lifting each other up. You destroyed Nathan's life, tried to control mine, and called it protection." But that wasn't protection. It was selfishness." Helen's face tightened, the realization of her actions settling in. Grace continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, Helen, but I'm moving on, and so is Nathan. We can't keep living in the shadow of what you did." With that, she turned and walked back into the center, leaving Helen standing alone, finally facing the consequences of her actions. Months later, life had taken on a new shape for Grace and Nathan. The Howard inheritance was reinstated, and rather than use it for personal luxury, they poured their resources into building a foundation dedicated to providing shelter, education, and job training for those in need. The center was a vibrant place, filled with hope and opportunity. Grace and Nathan worked side by side, helping people who, like Nathan once had, found themselves struggling against the weight of circumstance. They saw each success as a step forward, a chance to repay the kindness that had once sparked their own journey. One afternoon, as they stood on the center's porch, looking out at the bustling activity, Grace turned to Nathan, her expression warm and content. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met?" Nathan laughed softly. "Every day, but I think we were meant to cross paths. That maybe, even though it started as Helen's scheme, it was always leading us here." Grace smiled, slipping her hand into his. "Then I'm grateful for everything." They shared a quiet moment, feeling the peace that had settled over their lives. What had begun as a forced arrangement had grown into a partnership rooted in resilience, compassion, and shared purpose. Over the years, the Howard Turner Foundation became a beacon of hope for the city. Nathan's story of survival and Grace's dedication to helping others captured the hearts of people from all walks of life. Inspiring a movement of compassion and social change, they established shelters across the city, each one equipped not only to provide food and housing, but also to offer skills training and career counseling. Their foundation became a symbol of second chances, a place where people could rebuild their lives and reclaim their dignity. Grace and Nathan frequently spoke at events and universities, sharing their story to encourage others to look beyond appearances and embrace empathy. Their efforts sparked change not only in the city, but also in the perspectives of those who once held judgment and prejudice against the less fortunate. Their love deepened over time, bound by the trials they had faced together and the lives they had changed. They had turned their painful past into something meaningful, a legacy that would outlast them both and continue to inspire future generations. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch of their home, Nathan turned to Grace, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "For the longest time I didn't know who I was or where I belonged. But now, I realized that everything I went through led me here, to this moment, with you." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice soft and full of affection. "And to think it all began with a simple act of kindness on a busy street." "I'm glad I stopped, Nathan. I'm glad I didn't let Helen's words stop me from seeing you." They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey settling around them like a warm embrace. They knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but they were ready to face them. Together, as partners, as friends, as soulmates. Their story had come full circle, transforming from one of manipulation and control into a testament to love, resilience, and the power of compassion. And as they looked toward the future, they felt nothing but gratitude for the path that had brought them here, knowing that their journey had only just begun. In the years that followed, the Howard Turner Foundation expanded, with new centers opening in cities across the country. The foundation's mission became a rallying cry, inspiring others to give back, to help those who had been overlooked, to create communities built on empathy rather than judgment. At the grand opening of a new center, Nathan gave a speech, his words heartfelt and filled with conviction. "For years I believed I was alone, that kindness was something people like me didn't deserve. But Grace showed me that compassion can change a life. And now together, we want to share that compassion with the world." The audience erupted into applause, their hearts moved by his journey and the hope he represented. Grace joined him on stage, their hands entwined, a powerful symbol of the love and resilience that had brought them here. As they looked out over the crowd, Grace and Nathan knew that their story was just one of many, that their legacy would inspire others to create their own stories of kindness, of change, of hope. And in that moment, they felt an overwhelming sense of purpose, a joy that went beyond words. They had turned their pain into something beautiful, a beacon of light that would continue to shine for generations to come. As Grace and Nathan's story reminds us, sometimes the most powerful changes start with a single act of kindness. If you enjoyed this journey of love, resilience, and transformation, Make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you stories like this every week, filled with inspiration, hope, and unforgettable characters. Don't miss out on the next powerful story that's already on its way to you. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to get notified every time we share a new chapter of compassion and courage. Thank you for joining us, and we're so grateful to have you with us. Now take a moment to explore the links on your screen for more stories that will move and inspire you. We'll see you in the next one.